At 5:21 in the morning, while most of the Texas Panhandle was still asleep, the ground beneath one of the quietest stretches of the American plains suddenly moved. Not a tremor, not a rattle of windows that people brush off and forget by breakfast. A full, rolling shockwave tore upward from 3.5 miles below the surface, radiating outward in every direction until it had shaken homes in 4 states. Beds shifted, dishes fell from shelves. In small towns that had never once needed to think about earthquakes, people were startled awake by a sound many of them would later describe the same way. Not a crack, not a bang, but a deep, guttural rumble, as if something enormous had shifted far beneath their feet. Within minutes, phones across the region were lighting up with the same confused question, sent from neighbor to neighbor, from Amarillo to Lubbock, from Oklahoma City to towns in the Texas Hill Country that had no business feeling anything at all. Was that an earthquake? Here, in Texas. For a region that has spent generations defining itself by wide open sky, flat farmland, and a sense of geological calm, the idea of a serious earthquake has always felt like something that happens somewhere else. California shakes, Japan shakes, the Texas Panhandle does not shake. And yet, on the morning of July the 23rd, 2026, it did, hard enough that the United States Geological Survey confirmed what seismologists in the region had not seen in living memory. A magnitude 5. Zero earthquake, centered just northwest of the small town of Miami, Texas, and roughly 24 miles south-southeast of Spearman, near the top edge of the Texas-Oklahoma border. It was, by every official measurement, the strongest earthquake recorded in the Panhandle in over a century. And almost immediately, before the shaking had even fully settled, before residents had finished checking their homes for cracks, scientists were already asking the question that would come to define the following days. What just happened underneath Texas, and why? This is not a story about apocalyptic destruction. No buildings collapsed. No one was killed. The United States Geological Survey, in its initial assessment, projected the economic damage to be minimal, and as of the hours immediately following the quake, no structural failures or injuries had been confirmed. But that is precisely what makes this moment so unsettling to the scientists now studying it. This was not a catastrophe. It was a warning shot, a sudden violent reminder that the ground we assume to be stable is not always as fixed as we believe. And warning shots, in the world of seismology, are rarely simple. They are signals. They are the surface expression of something happening far below, in rock layers that have sat undisturbed for millions of years. And when those layers suddenly move without an obvious explanation, the scientific community does not shrug it off. It investigates. Because an earthquake that should not be happening, in a place where earthquakes almost never happen, is exactly the kind of anomaly that keeps geologists awake at night. To understand why this quake unsettled so many experts, you first have to understand what the Texas Panhandle actually is, geologically speaking. This is not a boundary region. It is not sitting near the edge of 2 tectonic plates grinding against each other, the way California sits along the San Andreas Fault, or the way the Pacific Northwest waits nervously above the Cascadia subduction zone. The Texas Panhandle sits deep in the interior of the North American plate, hundreds of miles from any active plate boundary. In classical seismology, this kind of location is considered about as geologically boring as it gets, a place where the underlying continental crust is thick, old, and largely undisturbed. Earthquakes in places like this are called intraplate earthquakes, and they are rare almost by definition, because there is no obvious tectonic engine driving them. When the ground moves in a place like California, scientists can point to a known, mapped, actively slipping fault system and say, this is exactly why. When the ground moves in the middle of the Texas Panhandle, the explanation is far less obvious and far more unsettling, because it means something is happening that does not fit the simple picture. According to the National Weather Service meteorologist who spoke with reporters in the immediate aftermath, the region does have minor fault lines running beneath it, ancient cracks in the crust, remnants of geological stress from tens of millions of years ago, capable of producing weak to moderate earthquakes under the right conditions. But those conditions are rare. Small earthquakes have occurred in the Panhandle over the past year or two, tremors so minor that most residents never even noticed them. What happened on July 23rd was categorically different. USGS records show that in more than a century of monitoring, the Panhandle has only recorded a handful of earthquakes at magnitude 4, 0 or greater. This one broke that entire historical record. Comparisons were immediately drawn to the last major regional event, a 4, 9 magnitude quake in Carson County back in 1925, a full century ago. Nothing since had come close. And now, in the span of a single early morning, a shock nearly 10 times more powerful in ground motion had ripped through the same quiet stretch of prairie. The scale of what people actually felt tells its own story. This was not a localized tremor confined to a small radius around the epicenter. Reports of shaking poured in from Amarillo and Lubbock, sprawling across the Texas South Plains. They came from Oklahoma City and Tulsa, well over 100 miles to the northeast. Residents near Kinsley, Kansas, roughly 200 miles from the epicenter, reported feeling the ground move beneath them. In western Oklahoma, in towns as far as Lawton, and even close to Wichita Falls, Texas, people described the same sudden jolt, the same disorienting seconds, where the floor seemed to shift under their feet. Some in Oklahoma City, sitting nearly 250 miles from where the earthquake actually originated, still felt it clearly enough to report it. For an earthquake of this magnitude, that kind of reach is significant, and it comes down to one critical detail buried in the USGS data: the shallow depth at which the quake occurred. Most of the Earth's most damaging seismic energy dissipates as it travels upward through rock, weakening the further it has to climb before reaching the surface. A deep earthquake, even a powerful one, often produces less noticeable shaking at the surface, simply because so much of its energy is absorbed on the way up. This quake did not have that luxury of distance. Originating at a depth of only around 3.5 miles, it was, geologically speaking, shockingly close to the surface. That shallow origin point meant the seismic energy had almost nowhere to dissipate before it reached homes, streets, and open plains. It exploded outward with minimal resistance, which explains why a single magnitude, 5.0 event managed to rattle communities in 4 different states, and why the United States Geological Survey received hundreds of "Did you feel it?" reports within hours, an unmistakable sign of just how widely this event registered across the region. But shallow depth alone does not explain the deeper mystery. And this is where the story shifts from a simple natural disaster narrative into something scientists are now actively racing to understand. Texas, and specifically the wider region, stretching from the Panhandle down through West Texas, has a complicated recent history with earthquakes, a history that is not purely natural. Over the last decade, seismologists working with the University of Texas and the United States Geological Survey have documented an unmistakable rise in seismic activity across parts of the state, and the driving force behind much of it has not been tectonic drift. It has been human activity, specifically the oil and gas industry's practice of injecting massive volumes of wastewater deep underground. Here is how that process works, and why it matters so much to this investigation. When oil companies extract crude through hydraulic fracturing, the process does not produce oil alone. For every barrel of oil brought to the surface, operations can generate between 3 and 6 barrels of contaminated salty wastewater, ancient brine that has been trapped in rock formations for millions of years, forced upward alongside the oil itself. This wastewater is toxic, difficult to treat, and far too costly to purify at the volumes being produced. So the industry's standard solution, used for decades, has been disposal by injection. The water is pumped back underground, often into deep rock formations, chosen specifically because they are porous enough to absorb it. Texas alone processes hundreds of millions of gallons of this wastewater every single day. For a long time, this practice was considered geologically safe, a closed loop that simply returned fluid to where it had originally come from. But as the volume of injected wastewater climbed year after year, seismologists began noticing something disturbing. Ancient dormant fault lines, cracks in the Earth's crust that had sat locked and motionless for millions of years, were waking up. The mechanism is almost deceptively simple. When enormous volumes of pressurized fluid are pumped into rock layers, that fluid can migrate along existing fault planes, effectively lubricating them and reducing the friction that has held them locked in place. A fault that might have taken another 10,000 years to slip on its own can be pushed past its breaking point in a matter of years, sometimes months. Once enough fluid pressure builds along its surface, the earthquake that results is not caused by tectonic plates grinding together in the traditional sense. It is caused by human engineering reaching down into the crust and disturbing a balance that had existed, undisturbed, since long before human civilization began. This is not speculation or fringe theory. It is documented, peer-reviewed science, and Texas has already lived through the consequences once, in a region not far from where this new quake struck. In 2022, inspectors with the Texas Railroad Commission, the state agency, despite its name, that actually regulates oil and gas operations, launched a formal investigation into a magnitude 5.4 earthquake that struck near Pecos in West Texas, close to the Reeves and Culberson County line. At the time, it was the largest earthquake recorded in the state since 1995, and the third largest in Texas history. Residents who lived through it described it in terms eerily similar to what Panhandle residents are describing now. One farmer in Reeves County said it felt like a truck had slammed into his house, followed by a sound like a powerful gust of wind tearing across the property. He had already spent years dealing with smaller quakes that had cracked his irrigation pipes and left a visible bulge across 2,000 acres of his land. Scientific studies conducted by the University of Texas and the USGS in the years following that event concluded that the vast majority of the seismic activity near Pecos had almost certainly been triggered by wastewater disposal from fracking operations, not by natural tectonic movement. And it was not an isolated finding. An analysis by Texas journalists tracking state seismic data found that earthquakes of magnitude 3, 0 or greater across Texas, had literally doubled in a single year, a statistic that lines up almost perfectly with the intensification of oil and gas activity across the Permian Basin. This is the backdrop against which the July 23rd Panhandle earthquake must be understood. Texas is a state where scientists have already proven, conclusively, that industrial activity can and does trigger major seismic events in regions that were previously considered geologically stable. So when officials say, in careful, measured language, that it remains too early to determine the cause of the Panhandle earthquake, they are not being evasive. They are being precise, because the honest answer right now is that nobody knows for certain, and there are at least two competing explanations that scientists must now work to separate. The first is the natural explanation, the minor ancient fault lines beneath the Panhandle finally releasing accumulated tectonic stress after who knows how many thousands of years of quiet pressure building along a crack in the crust. This kind of natural release does happen, even in supposedly stable interior regions, and it would fit the historical pattern of small, infrequent Panhandle earthquakes simply escalating to an unusually large event. The second explanation is the one that carries far more weight and far more consequence if it turns out to be true. Researchers will now be examining whether changes in underground pressure tied to oil and gas operations in the surrounding area contributed to, or even directly triggered, this earthquake. And the Panhandle is not exactly free of industrial activity. While it does not carry the same intensity of fracking operations as the Permian Basin further south, the region has its own long history of oil, gas, and wastewater disposal wells, part of the broader web of energy infrastructure that stretches across Texas and into Oklahoma. If seismologists trace this earthquake back to a nearby injection well, it would mean that the same pattern documented near Pecos in West Texas has now repeated itself, silently, in a completely different part of the state. A part of the state that had, until 3 weeks ago, gone unnoticed in these conversations, precisely because nobody expected trouble there. This is where the story shifts from a regional curiosity into something with far larger implications. If it turns out that industrial wastewater injection is capable of waking up dormant fault systems, not just in the heavily drilled Permian Basin, but in the far quieter Panhandle as well, that raises an uncomfortable question for regulators, energy companies, and residents across the entire state. How many other supposedly stable regions are sitting on top of similarly dormant faults, patiently absorbing pressure from nearby disposal wells, waiting for the threshold to be crossed? Texas seismologists have spent the last decade mapping known fault systems specifically because of this risk, but ancient faults do not always announce themselves on a map. Many remain undetected until the moment they finally slip, and by then, the earthquake itself becomes the discovery. A violent, involuntary survey of the crust beneath a region nobody thought to study closely before. The scientific response to this event has already begun to mobilize in a way that mirrors past investigations into Texas seismicity. Researchers from institutions like Southern Methodist University, which has a long track record of studying earthquake clusters in North Texas, will likely deploy portable seismic monitors across the Panhandle in the coming weeks, the same technique used years earlier to map a previously undocumented fault line running through the Dallas-Irving area after a string of smaller quakes struck that region. These portable monitors are capable of detecting the tiny aftershocks that follow a major seismic event, tremors far too small to be felt by residents, but large enough to reveal the exact geometry of the fault that ruptured. By plotting dozens, sometimes hundreds, of these aftershock locations, scientists can effectively draw an outline of a fault line that had never before been formally identified, turning an isolated, frightening event into a permanent addition to the geological record. Meanwhile, on the surface, life in the Panhandle has resumed its usual rhythm, but with an undercurrent of unease that was not there a week ago. Local emergency management officials have urged residents to inspect their homes for structural damage, particularly around foundations, chimneys, and older brick buildings that are more vulnerable to sudden ground shaking than newer construction. Aftershocks remain a real possibility following an earthquake of this magnitude, and seismologists have been clear that the days and weeks following a major seismic event are statistically when smaller follow-up quakes are most likely to occur as the crust settles into its new configuration following the initial rupture. Residents in towns like Spearman, a small community that suddenly found itself at the center of a geological mystery, have described a lingering sense of wariness, the instinct to flinch at every unexpected sound, every settling creak of a house, every distant rumble that might, or might not, be nothing at all. There's also a quieter, more human layer to this story. one that rarely makes it into the official seismic reports, but matters just as much to the people actually living through it. For generations, families in the Texas Panhandle built their sense of safety around the specific hazards their region was known for: tornadoes, drought, the occasional brutal ice storm sweeping down from the north. Earthquakes were never part of that mental checklist. They were something that happened to other places, other people, on the other side of a fault line map most residents had never bothered to look at. That sense of geological safety, unspoken but deeply held, was shattered in a matter of seconds on July 23rd. And once that kind of assumption breaks, it does not simply reset itself once the shaking stops. It lingers, quietly reshaping how an entire community thinks about the ground beneath their homes, their schools, their farmland that has been in their families for generations. For the energy industry operating across this part of Texas, the stakes tied to this investigation are enormous, though rarely discussed in plain terms. If regulators and independent researchers conclusively link this earthquake to wastewater disposal activity, it could trigger the same kind of regulatory response that followed the Pecos earthquake in 2022. Tighter restrictions on injection volumes, mandatory monitoring requirements near active wells, and in some cases, forced shutdowns of specific disposal sites identified as high risk. These are not small administrative inconveniences. They represent real operational and financial consequences for an industry that has built decades of infrastructure around the assumption that deep well injection is a safe, permanent solution for wastewater disposal. Every finding that links seismic activity to injection practices chips away at that assumption and forces a broader reckoning with how sustainable current disposal methods actually are, especially as fracking operations continue expanding into new corners of the state. At the same time, there's a competing pressure working in the opposite direction. Oil and gas remains one of the most powerful economic forces in Texas, and any regulatory action significant enough to slow disposal, well operations, carries political and financial weight that state agencies do not take lightly. The Texas Railroad Commission, the very body responsible for investigating incidents like this, has historically walked a careful line between environmental oversight and protecting an industry that generates enormous state revenue and employment. How aggressively officials pursue the cause of this particular earthquake and how transparently they report their findings once the investigation concludes will say a great deal about which side of that balance is currently winning inside Texas's regulatory apparatus. What makes this moment particularly striking, from a broader scientific perspective, is how it fits into a pattern researchers have been documenting across the central United States for more than a decade now, extending well beyond Texas's own borders. Oklahoma experienced its own dramatic surge in induced seismicity beginning around 2009, a surge so severe that a state which had previously recorded only a handful of earthquakes per year suddenly found itself experiencing hundreds annually, at the peak of a wastewater injection boom tied to its own oil and gas expansion. That crisis eventually forced Oklahoma regulators into sweeping changes, dramatically restricting injection volumes near known fault zones, after researchers definitively linked the state's earthquake surge to industrial activity. Texas, in many ways, has been following a similar trajectory over the past several years, just with a delayed timeline and a slightly different regulatory response. This Panhandle earthquake may represent the moment that trajectory accelerates once again, pulling a region that had so far stayed on the sidelines of this conversation directly into it. There is something almost poetic, in a deeply unsettling way, about the specific geography of where this earthquake struck. The Texas Panhandle has spent decades as a kind of geological footnote in these conversations, overshadowed by the more dramatic, more heavily studied seismic activity further south in the Permian Basin. It was the quiet region, the safe region, the place where energy companies and residents alike operated without the same level of seismic anxiety that had become almost routine in places like Pecos or Midland. That reputation is now, quite literally, cracked. And scientists studying this event are left grappling with a question that extends far beyond the immediate cause of a single earthquake. Whether the entire framework used to predict where induced seismicity is likely to occur needs to be reconsidered, given that a region long considered low risk has just produced the strongest earthquake recorded there in more than 100 years. As investigators comb through pressure data from nearby wells, cross-reference injection records with the precise timing and location of the earthquake, and wait for aftershock patterns to reveal the true shape of the fault that ruptured, the people of the Texas Panhandle are left in a strange kind of limbo. They know what happened. They felt it in their homes, in their beds, in the sudden silence that followed the rumble before anyone quite understood what they had just experienced. What they do not yet know is why, and more importantly, whether it will happen again. Scientists have been careful not to promise reassurance they cannot actually guarantee. Aftershocks remain possible. The underlying cause remains unconfirmed. And the broader question of whether this is a one-time natural event or the opening chapter of a longer, more troubling pattern tied to industrial activity beneath the Panhandle is a question that, as of now, no one on Earth can answer with full certainty. There is a particular kind of fear that comes from an earthquake in a place unprepared for one, and it is different from the fear residents of California or Alaska have learned to live with. In seismically active regions, building codes account for ground shaking. Schools run earthquake drills. Emergency planners keep evacuation protocols specifically tailored to structural collapse. None of that infrastructure exists in the same way across the Texas Panhandle because, until now, it was never considered necessary. Homes in small towns like Spearman and Miami were built with tornadoes and hailstorms in mind, not lateral ground displacement. That mismatch between what the built environment was designed to withstand and what it was actually forced to withstand on July 23rd is part of why emergency officials moved so quickly to urge structural inspections, even in the absence of confirmed damage. A single earthquake of this size does not need to bring a building down to reveal weaknesses in a foundation, weaknesses that might only become dangerous if a stronger aftershock, or a future unrelated quake, strikes the same stretch of ground again. It is also worth pausing on just how unusual it is for a single seismic event to be felt across 4 states simultaneously without producing serious damage anywhere. That combination, wide reach, paired with limited destruction, is itself a data point scientists are studying closely. It tells them something about the specific characteristics of the fault that ruptured, the type of slip that occurred along it, and how efficiently the surrounding rock transmitted that energy outward. Some faults rupture in a way that produces intense, damaging shaking concentrated near the epicenter, with rapid fall-off as distance increases. Others, depending on their orientation and the composition of the rock they sit within, can transmit energy far more efficiently across long distances, producing the kind of widespread, moderate shaking that so many residents from Amarillo to Oklahoma City to rural Kansas all reported feeling within minutes of each other. Understanding which category this fault falls into will help researchers model what a larger, more destructive event along the same structure might look like in the future. A scenario nobody wants to imagine, but one that responsible seismology requires them to consider. The Oklahoma comparison deserves a closer look, because it is the clearest precedent available for what a state-facing induced seismicity actually goes through once the science becomes undeniable. Before 2009, Oklahoma averaged only a handful of earthquakes above magnitude 3. 0 each year, a number so small that most residents never gave earthquakes a second thought. Within a few years of the state's shale boom accelerating, and with it a massive expansion in wastewater injection, that number exploded into the hundreds annually, eventually surpassing even California. Historically, the earthquake capital of the continental United States, in total seismic events recorded in a single year. It took years of mounting evidence, dozens of studies from university researchers and the USGS, and considerable political pressure from residents and insurance companies alike before Oklahoma regulators finally acted, imposing strict volume limits on injection wells located near mapped fault systems. The earthquakes did not stop overnight, but they slowed considerably, offering something close to real-world proof that human-caused seismicity, once identified, can actually be managed through deliberate regulatory action. Texas now finds itself facing a version of that same reckoning, except this time the warning sign has appeared not in the heavily drilled Permian Basin, where everyone already expected trouble, but in a region that had, until 3 weeks ago, remained almost entirely off that particular map. For residents living through this in real time, the science moves frustratingly slower than the questions they're asking. Seismic investigations of this kind are not resolved in days. Pressure records from nearby wells have to be requested, cross-referenced, and analyzed against the precise timing of the rupture. Portable monitoring equipment has to be deployed, calibrated, and left in place for weeks or months to capture enough aftershock data to actually map the fault geometry with confidence. Peer review, the process by which findings are checked and validated by other scientists before being treated as established fact, can stretch investigations out even further, sometimes by a year or more after the initial event. In the meantime, the people of the Panhandle are left living directly on top of an active, unresolved scientific question, going about their daily lives while researchers slowly piece together an answer that may not arrive for months. There is one more detail worth sitting with before this story closes, because it says something about how quietly these things can build before they finally break the surface. The wells that scientists will now be scrutinizing near the Panhandle, the ones that may or may not turn out to be connected to this earthquake, have in many cases been operating for years without incident, injecting wastewater into the same underground formations day after day, month after month, with no visible consequence at the surface. That is precisely how induced seismicity tends to work. It is not usually a single dramatic trigger. It is accumulation, pressure building gradually along a fault plane that nobody was watching closely because nobody had reason to, until one day the accumulated stress finally exceeds what the rock can hold, and the release comes all at once, indistinguishable in the moment from a purely natural event. Only afterward, once researchers go back through years of injection records and pressure logs, does the slower story usually become visible, if it exists at all. That is the process now quietly underway across the Texas Panhandle, hidden from view, running in parallel to the daily lives of the people who felt the ground move beneath them and are still waiting to understand exactly why. What we are left with, in the end, is a moment that captures something larger than a single earthquake in a single region of Texas. It is a reminder of how thin the line actually is between the ground we assume to be permanent and the ground that is, in reality, constantly shifting beneath layers of pressure we rarely think about. Pressure that is sometimes entirely natural and sometimes, uncomfortably, of our own making. The Texas Panhandle did not choose to become a case study in modern seismology. It simply woke up one morning in July, shook violently for a handful of terrifying seconds, and became one, whether the region wanted that role or not. Somewhere beneath the wheat fields and cattle ranches, beneath the small towns that have defined themselves for generations by their distance from disaster, a fault line that had stayed silent for over 100 years finally spoke. And right now, all across the scientific community, researchers are still trying to figure out exactly what it said and whether it is finished speaking just yet.